What happens when one of the most polarizing figures in modern royalty sits down with late-night television's most notorious satirist? You won't believe what unfolds when Meghan Markle steps into Stephen Colbert's domain, expecting softball questions and celebrity treatment, only to find herself face-to-face with the host's sharpest wit and most probing inquiries. The tension that erupted last night between these two powerful personalities created television gold that has everyone talking, and by the end of this explosive encounter, one of them would storm off the stage in absolute fury. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two titans of media clash in what became the most uncomfortable interview of the year. The Late Show studio buzzed with an electric energy as Meghan Markle made her entrance, radiating confidence in a sleek black blazer that screamed power and authority. The audience erupted in applause, but something felt different tonight. Stephen Colbert's usual warm welcome seemed measured, calculated, as if he was sizing up his guest before the real show began. His trademark grin appeared more predatory than friendly, and those who know Colbert's interview style could sense the storm brewing beneath his polished exterior. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Meghan Markle," Colbert announced, but his tone carried an undertone that suggested this wouldn't be the typical celebrity puff piece. As Meghan settled into the guest chair, her posture was pristine, her smile camera-ready, but her eyes held a wariness that betrayed her inner tension. She had clearly come prepared for battle, though perhaps not the kind that was about to unfold. The opening pleasantries felt forced, with both host and guest exchanging verbal chess moves disguised as small talk. Colbert complimented her recent, charitable endeavors with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, while Meghan responded with practiced grace, but her answers felt rehearsed, almost robotic in their perfection. The studio audience, sensing the undercurrent of tension, fell into an unusual quiet that made every pause feel loaded with significance. "So, Meghan," Colbert began, leaning back in his chair with deceptive casualness, "you've been quite vocal about your experiences with the British press, haven't you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Meghan's perfectly composed expression flickered for just a moment. Her media training kicked in immediately, but not before viewers caught that split second of genuine reaction. "Well, Stephen, I think it's important to speak truth to power," she replied, her voice steady but with an edge that hadn't been there moments before. "When you're subjected to a coordinated campaign of harassment and misinformation, staying silent isn't really an option." Her hands, previously folded demurely in her lap, now gestured with more animation, betraying the passion building beneath her controlled exterior. Colbert nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Truth to power, absolutely. But some might argue that using your platform to criticize an institution that made you a global household name is, well, let's say ungrateful." The word ungrateful landed like a slap, and the studio audience audibly gasped. Meghan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but her media training held firm. "Ungrateful?" Meghan repeated, her voice maintaining its composure but carrying a new weight. "Stephen, I think we need to be very careful about the narrative we're perpetuating here. Speaking about systemic racism and institutional protection of harmful behaviors isn't ingratitude. It's accountability." Her eyes flashed with something dangerous, and those familiar with her interviews knew she was entering combat mode. The host pressed forward, sensing he'd found a nerve. "But accountability goes both ways, doesn't it? I mean, you and Harry have made quite the career out of your royal grievances. Netflix deals, book contracts, speaking engagements. It's been quite lucrative, hasn't it?" The question was delivered with Colbert's signature satirical tone, but the barb was unmistakable, and the studio fell dead silent. Meghan's composure cracked slightly, her perfectly applied smile faltering as her eyes narrowed. "I'm sorry, are you suggesting that speaking about our experiences is somehow mercenary? That sharing our truth is a business venture?" Her voice rose just enough to signal that the gloves were about to come off, and even Colbert seemed to realize he might have pushed harder than intended. "I'm not suggesting anything," Colbert replied with mock innocence. "I'm just observing that trauma seems to be very profitable for some people." The comment was delivered with his typical comedic timing, but the cruel undertone was impossible to miss. The audience was now completely transfixed, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented unfold in real time. Meghan leaned forward in her chair, her royal composure finally beginning to crack under the sustained assault. "Profitable?" she repeated, her voice taking on a harder edge. "Stephen, let me be very clear about something. When you're dealing with an institution that has literally centuries of experience in destroying people who threaten their narrative, fighting back isn't profitable. It's survival." Her words carried a venom that transformed the atmosphere in the studio from uncomfortable to genuinely hostile. The host, perhaps realizing he'd crossed into dangerous territory but unable to back down, doubled down on his approach. "But surely, you understand why some people might question the timing of all these revelations? I mean, speaking out after you've left, after you've secured your financial future. It does raise questions about motivations, doesn't it?" His tone remained conversational, but the implication was crystal clear, and Meghan's face began to flush with barely contained anger. "Questions about motivations?" Meghan's voice was now sharp enough to cut glass. "Let me ask you something, Stephen. When someone finally escapes an abusive situation, do you question their motivations for speaking out, or do you listen to what they're saying?" The comparison to abuse was deliberate and inflammatory, and the studio audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the interview was spiraling completely out of control. Colbert's expression hardened, his comedic mask slipping to reveal something much less pleasant underneath. "That's quite a comparison, Meghan. Abuse is a serious accusation. Are you really suggesting that being a member of the British royal family, with all the privileges and protections that entails, constitutes abuse?" His words dripped with skepticism and barely concealed disdain, and it was clear that both host and guest had abandoned any pretense of civility. The tension in the studio was now suffocating, with crew members exchanging worried glances and the audience sitting in stunned silence. Meghan's hands were clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white, and her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the flush of anger spreading across her cheeks. The interview had transformed from entertainment into something much darker and more personal, and everyone present could sense that they were about to witness something that would define both of these public figures' legacies. "Stephen," Meghan said, her voice now carrying a dangerous quiet that somehow felt more threatening than shouting, "I think you're showing exactly the kind of dismissive attitude that perpetuates harmful systems. When someone speaks about their experiences, especially experiences involving racism and institutional gaslighting, questioning their credibility instead of listening to their truth is part of the problem." Her words were measured, but the fury behind them was unmistakable, and it was clear that she was preparing for war. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would go down in television history, with neither participant willing to back down, and both clearly prepared to say whatever it took to emerge victorious from this increasingly toxic exchange. Colbert straightened in his chair, his professional mask completely abandoned, as he prepared to deliver what would become the most controversial moment of his career. "Meghan, let's talk about racism since you brought it up. You've made some pretty serious allegations about the royal family. But isn't it convenient that these accusations only surfaced after you were already on your way out? I mean, if the situation was as dire as you claim, why didn't you speak up when you actually had the power to change things from within?" His words were delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut deep, and the effect was immediate and devastating. Meghan's entire demeanor shifted in that moment, her carefully maintained composure finally shattering like glass hitting concrete. Her eyes blazed with a fury that seemed to illuminate the entire studio, and when she spoke, her voice carried a raw intensity that made everyone present lean forward despite themselves. "Power to change things from within?" she repeated, her tone dripping with incredulity. "Stephen, you clearly have no understanding of how these institutions work. You don't change them from within. They change you, or they destroy you. And let me be very clear about something. Questioning the timing of someone speaking about racism says far more about you than it does about me." The host, perhaps sensing he'd finally broken through her defenses but unable to resist pushing further, leaned forward with predatory interest. "But come on, Meghan. You have to admit the optics are terrible. You marry into the most prestigious family in the world, get a fairy tale wedding watched by millions, and then when things get tough, you bail and spend the next few years trashing them publicly. That doesn't look like someone standing up to racism. That looks like someone who couldn't handle the pressure and is now seeking revenge." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas, and even the studio crew seemed to recoil from its toxicity. Meghan stood up so abruptly that her chair rolled backward, the sudden movement causing several audience members to gasp audibly. Her entire body was trembling with rage, and when she spoke, her voice carried a power that seemed to fill every corner of the studio. "Couldn't handle the pressure?" "Stephen, let me paint you a picture of what that pressure looked like. Imagine waking up every day to headlines calling you everything from a social climber to a destroyer of traditions, having your every gesture analyzed and criticized, watching your own family be turned against you by an institution that values its reputation over human decency, and then, when you finally find the courage to speak your truth, having people like you question whether your trauma is real or just a business opportunity." The studio audience was now completely silent, transfixed by the raw emotion pouring from both participants. Colbert, perhaps realizing he'd unleashed something he couldn't control, attempted to regain some composure, but his voice betrayed his discomfort. "Look, I'm not questioning your trauma. I'm questioning the way you've chosen to monetize it. There's a difference between healing and performing your pain for profit." The words were meant to sound reasonable, but they landed with the force of a sledgehammer, and Meghan's reaction was immediate and explosive. "Monetize my trauma?" Meghan's voice rose to a level that made the studio microphones crackle with feedback. "You want to talk about monetizing trauma, Stephen? You've built an entire career making jokes about other people's pain. Every night, you stand behind that desk and mock politicians, celebrities, and public figures for the entertainment of your audience. You profit from creating content that often causes real harm to real people, and then you have the audacity to lecture me about exploitation?" Her words were like arrows finding their target, and for the first time in the interview, Colbert looked genuinely rattled. The host's face flushed red as he struggled to regain control of the situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his ability to manage. "That's completely different, and you know it. Political satire serves a public purpose. It holds power accountable. What you're doing is settling personal scores while wrapping it in the language of social justice." His voice cracked slightly, on the last words betraying the fact that Meghan's counterattack had found its mark, but he pressed forward with desperate determination. "Personal scores?" Meghan laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, only bitter irony that made everyone in the studio shift uncomfortably. "Stephen, when you're dealing with an institution that has spent centuries perfecting the art of character assassination, everything becomes personal. When they use their media connections to plant stories about you being difficult, demanding, or divisive, that's personal. When they leak private conversations to make you look bad, that's personal. And when so-called journalists and comedians like you perpetuate those narratives without questioning their source or motivation, that becomes very personal indeed." The accusation that he was complicit in the very system Meghan was criticizing hit Colbert like a physical blow, and his response was immediate and defensive. "Don't you dare try to make me complicit in your narrative. I ask tough questions. That's my job. If you can't handle scrutiny, Maybe you shouldn't have chosen to live your life in the public eye." His words were sharp, but they carried an undertone of desperation that suggested he knew he was losing control of the conversation. Meghan moved closer to his desk, her presence now dominating the entire stage as she prepared to deliver what would become the most quoted moment of the entire confrontation. "Handle scrutiny? Stephen, there's a difference between legitimate scrutiny and character assassination. There's a difference between asking tough questions and perpetuating harmful stereotypes. And there's a difference between holding people accountable and participating in a coordinated campaign to destroy someone's reputation because they dared to challenge a system that benefits people like you." The phrase, "people like you," landed with devastating effect, and Colbert's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, anger, and something that looked almost like fear. "People like me? What exactly is that supposed to mean?" he demanded, his voice rising as he finally began to match Meghan's intensity. But it was clear that she had seized control of the narrative and wasn't about to relinquish it. "It means people who benefit from systems of privilege and power, who profit from maintaining the status quo, and who attack anyone who threatens their comfortable position by speaking uncomfortable truths." Meghan's words were delivered with the precision of a prosecutor making a closing argument, and the effect on both Colbert and the studio audience was electric. You sit behind that desk every night, protected by your position, your network, your audience, and you use that platform to tear down people who are trying to create change. And then you wonder why some of us fight back. The confrontation had now reached a fever pitch that seemed to charge the very air in the studio with electricity, and it was clear that both participants had crossed lines from which there would be no return. Colbert shot up from his chair, his face now matching the intensity of Meghan's fury as he abandoned any pretense of professional conduct. "You know what, Meghan? You want to talk about privilege and power? Let's talk about the privilege of marrying into royalty and then having the audacity to play victim when the fairy tale doesn't work out exactly as you planned. You had everything handed to you on a silver platter, and when it required actual work and sacrifice, you ran away and then spent years pointing fingers at everyone else for your failures." His voice cracked with emotion, revealing just how deeply her accusations had wounded his sense of professional integrity. The studio audience was now completely transfixed by the spectacle unfolding before them, some covering their mouths in shock while others pulled out their phones to capture what was clearly becoming television history. Meghan's response was swift and merciless, her voice cutting through the charged atmosphere like a blade. "Handed to me on a silver platter? Stephen, you clearly live in a fantasy world if you think being subjected to daily racist attacks in the press, having your mental health ignored by an institution that claims to care about its members, and watching your husband suffer because he can't protect his family constitutes a fairy tale. But I suppose when you've spent your entire career making money off other people's pain, it's hard to recognize real suffering when you see it." The host's face contorted with rage as he realized he was being systematically dismantled by someone he had clearly underestimated. "Don't lecture me about suffering, Meghan. You chose this life. You knew what you were getting into when you married Harry. The rest of us don't get to opt out of our responsibilities when things get difficult." His words were meant to wound, but they revealed more about his own frustrations than about Meghan's choices, and she seized on this weakness with predatory precision. "Chose this life?" Meghan's laugh was sharp and bitter, filling the studio with its harsh resonance. "Stephen, nobody chooses to be racially abused by an entire media ecosystem. Nobody chooses to have their characters systematically destroyed by people who have never met them. And nobody chooses to watch their spouse's family participate in their destruction rather than defend them. But you know what I did choose? I chose to fight back. I chose to speak my truth rather than suffer in silence like they expected me to. And clearly that choice threatens people like you who profit from maintaining these toxic systems." The accusation, That he profited from toxic systems sent Colbert into a fury that surprised even those who knew him well. "People like me? You keep saying that phrase like it means something. I've spent my entire career speaking truth to power, holding politicians and public figures accountable for their actions. The fact that you can't handle being held to the same standard doesn't make me part of some conspiracy against you." His voice was now hoarse from shouting, and his usual comedic timing had completely abandoned him, leaving only raw anger and defensive desperation. Meghan stepped even closer to his desk, her presence now completely dominating the stage as she prepared to deliver the killing blow that would end this confrontation once and for all. Speaking truth to power? Stephen, you're not speaking truth to power. You're speaking power to truth. You use your platform to attack people who threaten the comfortable narratives that keep your audience entertained and your ratings high. Real truth-telling would mean examining why someone like me gets treated differently than other members of the royal family. Real truth-telling would mean asking why the media spent years building up a fairy tale romance only to tear it down. The moment we didn't play our assigned roles perfectly, the studio fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the cameras seemed deafening. Colbert stood frozen behind his desk, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to formulate a response that could possibly match the devastating accuracy of Meghan's final assault. His usual quick wit had completely deserted him, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in a way that his audience had never seen before. "You want to know what the real difference is between us, Stephen?" Meghan continued, her voice now dropping to a conversational tone that somehow felt more threatening than all her previous shouting. "I gave up everything to stand up for what I believed in. I walked away from titles, from financial security, from family connections, because I refused to be complicit in a system that was destroying me and my family. You, on the other hand, are so invested in maintaining your position within these systems that you'll attack anyone who threatens to expose their true nature, even when that person is fighting for basic human dignity." The host finally found his voice, but what emerged was a shadow of his former confidence. "You didn't give up anything, Meghan. You traded one form of celebrity for another. You went from being a duchess to being a professional victim, and you've made millions doing it." The words were meant to be his final devastating comeback, but they fell flat in the charged atmosphere, sounding more like the desperate flailing of someone who knew they had already lost. Meghan's smile was cold and triumphant as she delivered her final response. "A professional victim? Stephen, if speaking about racism, institutional abuse, and mental health makes me a professional victim, then I'll wear that label proudly. But what does it make you? Someone who attacks people for having the courage to speak about things you're too comfortable to address? Someone who uses his platform to silence voices that threaten his worldview rather than examining why those voices make him so uncomfortable?" She paused, letting the words sink in before delivering her final blow. "I came here tonight thinking I was going to have a conversation with a thoughtful interviewer. Instead, I found someone who's become everything he claims to oppose. Someone who uses his power to attack people who can't fight back on equal terms." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Meghan gathering her things with deliberate precision. She straightened her blazer, checked her appearance in the reflection of a nearby camera, and then turned to face Colbert one final time. "You know what, Stephen? This conversation has been more revealing than I expected, just not in the way you probably hoped. You've shown your audience exactly who you really are, and I think they're smart enough to draw their own conclusions." Colbert stood motionless behind his desk, his face a mixture of rage, humiliation, and something that looked disturbingly like recognition of his own failures. His mouth moved as if he wanted to say something, anything, that could salvage his dignity from this complete destruction, but no words came. The man who had built his career on having the last word had been rendered completely speechless by someone he had clearly underestimated.